Sit down, Diane. You are not walking out of this dinner. But I didn't sit down. And I didn't shout. I just stood there and let the room go quiet. 11 people watched my mother-in-law rise at the head of the table, a manila envelope shaking in her hand. "This proves your daughter isn't my son's," she said, loud enough for the whole room. "Tonight, everyone finally sees what you really are." She had secretly tested my 3-year-old's DNA. She'd planned this dinner for weeks. She wanted an audience when my marriage came apart. Everyone braced for me to break, to cry, to beg, to explain. Instead, I looked at her, and I said the only thing that could stop her. "Then open it, Vivian. Read it out loud, every word." Now, I know how that sounds. The quiet daughter-in-law telling her to open it herself. But Vivian didn't know the test she'd ordered to destroy me was about to turn in her own hand, in front of everyone she'd spent 30 years trying to impress. And the secret it would drag into the light, she'd buried for 44 years and worn around her neck the entire time. By the end of that dinner, nothing in this family was ever the same. My name is Diane Merrick. And to understand how that envelope ended the wrong woman, I have to take you back 7 years, to the first time Vivian opened her front door to me. I'm 38 years old and am a hospice aide, and I had found out about that test 13 days before that dinner. I had decided in those 13 days to say nothing, to let her stand up in front of the whole family and open that envelope with her own hands. Because I already knew what it would say about my daughter. And I had begun to suspect what it might say about the woman holding it. What happened when she opened it in front of 11 people is the reason I can tell you this now. 2 years later, with my daughter asleep down the hall and my hands perfectly steady. So let me take you back to that first day, 7 years before the envelope, when Vivian Merrick opened her front door and looked at me like a delivery she hadn't ordered. I was 31 when Mark brought me home to meet his mother. We'd been together 8 months. Mark had warned me, gently, in the car, "She takes a while to warm up. Just be yourself." I've thought about that sentence a lot since. Just be yourself. As if the problem were ever going to be me. Vivian opened the door like she was receiving a delivery she hadn't ordered. She didn't hug me. She shook my hand. A firm, dry grip, her eyes already moving over me, cataloging. My shoes, my coat, the way I held myself. I had grown up without much, and I'd spent my whole life learning to read a room fast, and I read that room in about 4 seconds. I was being appraised, and I was not going to appraise well. Dinner was pot roast and small talk. Mark's father, Warren, was kind in the vague way of a man who'd learned long ago to stay out of his wife's weather. Mark's younger sister, Courtney, watched me the way you watch a new coworker you've already decided not to like. And Vivian ran the whole table the way she ran everything, quietly, with a smile, steering. She waited until dessert. Then she asked, lightly, as if it were nothing, "And what is it your family does, Diane?" I said my mother had raised me alone and had cleaned houses, and that I was proud of her. I watched something settle in Vivian's face, a small, satisfied click, like a lock finding its bolt. She'd found what she was looking for. I wasn't the right kind of person. I would never be the right kind of person. And in her mind, from that dessert forward, I was a girl of no particular background who had gotten her hands on her son. There was one more thing that night, and I only understood it much later. As the evening wound down, Warren asked her something ordinary, whether she'd found the photos from some family reunion he wanted to show me. And Vivian's face did something strange. It closed, fast, like a hand making a fist. "I don't know where those are," she said, too sharply for the question. And she changed the subject so hard the whole table felt the turn. Warren just nodded and let it go, the practiced nod of a man who'd learned which doors not to knock on. And she wore a locket, gold, old, on a thin chain, tucked mostly under her collar. She touched it once, during a lull in the conversation, And I noticed because it was the only unguarded thing she did all evening. Her fingers went to it the way you touch a scar you've stopped explaining to people. When she caught me looking, her hand dropped like she'd been burned, and the appraising smile came back up like a shade being drawn. I didn't think anything of it then. A cold woman with a locket she didn't like being seen touching. Why would I? I was 31 and trying to survive dessert. But I want you to remember that locket, and remember Warren's face when the photos came up. Because those two small things, 7 years apart from the truth, were the truth the whole time. I just didn't have the rest of it yet. If you've ever had someone decide you didn't belong before they ever bothered to know you, stay with me. This one's for you. And do me a small favor first. Hit like and subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. There's a new confession here every day, and I like knowing who's out there in the quiet with me. I want to be fair to the 7 years between that dinner and the one that changed everything, because they weren't all war. They were worse than war. They were a slow, quiet campaign, conducted entirely in things that could never quite be called out loud. Vivian never insulted me. Not once, not in 7 years. Never person and say, look, this is what she did. That was the genius of it, and it took me years to even understand it as strategy rather than personality. She complimented me. That was the weapon. Diane's so practical, she'd say to a room full of her friends, with a warm smile, and everyone would nod, and only I would hear the rest of the sentence, the part that lived under it. Not refined, not educated, not our kind. It's wonderful how you just don't worry about what people think, she told me once, at a garden party, in front of 6 women in linen, meaning, of course, that I should worry, that I'd worn the wrong thing again, that I'd never learn. When Mark and I got engaged, she cried at the announcement dinner. Real tears. And then she dabbed her eyes and told the table the tears were because her son was finally settling down, in his own way. In his own way. 3 words that turned our engagement into something he'd compromised on. When we married, she wore black, head to toe, to her son's wedding. When my own mother, who cleaned houses for 30 years and has more grace in her little finger than Vivian has in her whole body, gently asked if everything was all right, Vivian smiled and said, "Oh, it's just so slimming, isn't it? And at my age, one has to choose comfort." She'd found a way to wear mourning to my wedding and make it sound like a compliment to herself. I could give you 50 more. The Christmas she gave Mark's sister a down payment on a house and gave us a gravy boat. The way she introduced me for years as Mark's Diane, never quite letting me be a Merrick. The time she rearranged the photos on her wall so that our wedding picture ended up in the downstairs hallway, by the coat closet where the light was bad. I could have fought her. I thought about it some nights. But I'd spent my childhood watching my mother keep her dignity in the homes of women who treated her like furniture, and my mother taught me the only thing that ever actually beats a woman like Vivian. You do not give her the fight she's fishing for. You stay kind, you stay steady, and you let her cruelty sit out in the open with no one to catch it. So that's what I did, for 7 years. And then Lily was born. I'd hoped, I really had, I'm almost embarrassed to admit how much, that a grandchild would soften her. That's the thing about being the one who's decided against. You never fully stop auditioning for the part of family member. 7 years in, and I still caught myself hoping Lily would be the thing that finally made Vivian love me, or at least call a truce. And for about a day, it seemed like it might work. Vivian came to the hospital, and she held Lily, this brand new red-haired scrap of a person, and something moved across her face that I had never seen there before and could not name at the time. Something almost like grief. Her free hand went up to that locket and closed around it, and her eyes went somewhere far away. And for one fragile moment I thought, this is it. This is where it all changes. She's holding a baby and remembering how to be soft. I understand that moment completely now. Of course I do. She wasn't looking at her granddaughter and softening. She was holding a newborn and being dragged without warning back to the last newborn she'd held. For one day, in 1979, before they took him. She wasn't melting toward Lily. She was drowning in James. And I mistook her private agony for a thaw because I didn't yet know she had a James. None of us did. It didn't change. It got worse, and it got worse for a reason so stupid and so human that it still takes my breath away. Lily didn't look like the Merricks. Mark's family were all fair, straight-haired, long in the face, pale as January. And Lily came out with a riot of red gold curls and warm brown eyes and a round little face and dimples, and she was, and is, the single most beautiful thing I have ever laid eyes on. But she didn't look like them. She looked, everyone said, like my side. Like my mother, who had the same wild hair before it went gray. For most families, that's a non-event. Kids look like somebody. But I started to notice Vivian watching my daughter across the table with a particular stillness. Not warmth, study. I'd catch her looking at Lily's curls, and then sliding her eyes to me, and then to Mark, and then to the middle distance, and I could practically hear the adding machine running behind her face. Red hair, brown eyes. Nobody on our side has that. Where did that come from? Who does that come from? I knew that look. I'd have known it anywhere. It was the exact look she'd given me over dessert 7 years earlier. The look of a woman who has decided something is wrong and has just started assembling her evidence. Except this time, it wasn't my shoes or my mother's job she was building a case about. It was whether my 3-year-old belonged to my husband. She looked at that beautiful child eating buttered noodles, and instead of seeing her granddaughter, she saw a question. A case to be made. A way, finally, to prove that the girl her son married had been lying all along. Here's the part where I have to tell you about my job, because it matters more than it should. I'm a hospice aide, have been for 15 years. It's not a job most people want to hear about at parties. I sit with people in the last weeks and days of their lives. I bathe them and I turn them so they don't get sores, and I hold their hands at 3 in the morning when the fear comes in, because it always comes in, and it always comes in worst at 3. And I'll tell you what 15 years of that work teaches you, because it's the same thing that saved my family. And it's the reason I could do what I did. It teaches you that everyone is carrying something they never said out loud. Everyone. The kind, church-going grandmother and the gruff old veteran and the sweet woman everybody loved, all of them, at the end, have a room inside them they kept locked their whole lives. And here's the thing nobody tells you. At the very end, the locks come off. Not because they get brave, because the weight finally gets too heavy to carry one more step, and they have to set it down before they go. I have had a dying man tell me about a child he abandoned in 1961. I have had a woman wait until her husband left the room, and then tell me, in a whisper, that she'd loved someone else her entire marriage. I have heard confessions that would stop your heart, held for 50, 60 years, coming out in the last breath like air out of a punctured tire. So I learned 2 things you can't learn anywhere else. I learned to sit with a terrible secret and not flinch, not judge, not run. And I learned to feel one in the room before anyone says a word, the particular gravity a person carries when they're guarding something. It has a weight. You learn to feel the weight. So when Vivian started doing her arithmetic over my daughter's red curls, I didn't panic, and I didn't cry, and I didn't run to Mark. I watched her, the way I watch a patient's breathing change in the night, noticing the shift, knowing what it means, staying calm. I knew she was building towards something, and underneath that, quieter, I felt the other thing. The thing I'd felt since the first night over dessert when her hand went to that locket. I felt the weight she was carrying. I just didn't know yet what it was. I found out from a woman named Rachel, and I found out by pure accident, which is the only reason any of this happened the way it did. Rachel's mother was one of my patients that spring, a lovely, bird-like woman named Eleanor in her final few weeks, And I sat with her most days, held her hand through the bad afternoons, sang to her when the morphine made her frightened. Rachel came after her own work let out, and while Eleanor slept, we'd stand in the hallway with bad coffee and talk the way you do with someone you're going through something hard alongside. Over a couple of weeks we got close, the way you do in those hallways. And Rachel, it turned out, worked the intake desk at a genetics lab 2 towns over. The kind of place that does paternity tests and ancestry kits. She was careful. She never used a client's name, she knew the rules. But she'd tell me the shapes of things to pass the time while her mother slept. And one afternoon, stirring her coffee, she told me a shape that stopped my heart. "You would not believe the family drama that walks through our door," she said. "Had a woman in this week. Older, real fur coat, rude to everyone at the desk. Comes in with a little kid's hairbrush in a Ziploc bag and wants us to run it against a grown man's sample. Rush order. Paid cash, wanted it quiet." Rachel shook her head. Testing her own grandbaby against her son, near as any of us could tell. Can you imagine what that lands like on a family? She never said a name. She didn't have to. Because I was already doing the math, and the math only had one answer. An older woman, fur coat, that particular rudeness. A lab 2 towns over, the 2 towns between us and Vivian. A hairbrush, a little girl. A rush order, paid cash so nothing would show. And Vivian, just that week, pushing so hard for a proper family Sunday, everyone together, that she'd called 3 times to confirm the date. I sat in that hallway with my cold coffee and I put it together piece by piece, and I kept my face very still, because 15 years of sitting with the dying teaches you to keep your face still while your whole world moves underneath you. "That's a hard thing," I said, "for everybody in it." And Rachel agreed, and went back into her mother, and never knew, still doesn't know to this day, that she'd just handed me 13 days and the shape of the truth. I stood in that hospice hallway and I felt the floor tilt, and then I felt it go very, very still. Because I knew 3 things in that moment, all at once. I knew my daughter was my husband's child, beyond any doubt, and that the test would say so. I knew Vivian had just spent her own money to prove herself right, and was about to prove herself catastrophically wrong. And I knew one more thing. The way I know when a patient has 3 days left. A knowing that comes from 15 years of sitting with what people hide. A woman does not become this obsessed with someone else's bloodline unless something is very wrong with her own. If you've ever known, in one clean second, that the person trying to destroy you was about to hand you the thing that would save you, type the word envelope in the comments. Stay with me. This is where I made the choice I'd make again. I had 13 days, and in those 13 days, I could have done the obvious thing. I could have told Mark. I could have called Vivian and said I knew and watched her scramble to bury it. I could have stopped the whole thing before it reached that table. I didn't do any of it. And I need to be honest with you about why, because this is the part some people hear and don't understand, and I understand why they don't. It comes down to this. For 7 years, Vivian had run her whole campaign in the dark. In things that could never be proven. In smiles that left no fingerprints. In compliments that were really knives. In a black dress at a wedding that was somehow always going to be about comfort if anyone asked. Every single cruelty had been deniable. That was the architecture of her. You could never once catch her holding the knife. So think about what would have happened if I'd confronted her in private. If I'd called her up and said, "Vivian, I know about the lab. I know about the hairbrush. Stop this now." She would have stopped. That one test. And then it would have become one more thing that happened in the dark. In her version, told to Warren and Courtney over the phone that same night, it would have become, Diane got hysterical. Diane made wild accusations. Diane doesn't understand how much a grandmother worries. Diane's people are like that. She would have reframed it before the sun came up. She'd been reframing things for 7 years. She was a master of it. I would have won the battle and lost, again, the only war that mattered, the war over who I got to be in that family. But if I let her carry it all the way to the table, if I let her stand up in front of Warren and Courtney and Margot and the whole family, glowing with certainty, and open that envelope with her own hand, then it wouldn't be my accusation anymore. It would be hers. Whatever came out of that envelope, she would be the one who brought it into the light, in front of everyone, on purpose. There would be no reframing that. You cannot spin a thing you did in front of 11 witnesses at your own dinner table. But if I let her carry this all the way to the table, if I let her stand up in front of Warren and Courtney and the whole family, certain of her victory, and open that envelope herself, then whatever was inside it would be undeniable. She would be the one who brought it into the light. Not me, her. I didn't know yet exactly what else was in there. I only had 15 years of instinct telling me the locket meant something, that a woman testing everyone else's blood was a woman terrified of her own. But I trusted that instinct. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I did nothing. I let her build her stage, and I made sure I'd be standing on it when it came down. And I want to say the honest thing here, the thing I've had to make my peace with. I knew, those 13 days, that I was protecting Lily and hurting Mark at the very same time. There was no version where I kept my daughter from becoming a question mark and also spared my husband the ambush. Protecting one meant wounding the other. That is not a clean choice. I want you to know I felt every bit of how unclean it was, every one of those 13 nights, lying next to a man I loved and letting him sleep in the dark. I didn't do it because it was clean. I did it because it was the only door that led all the way out. I even helped it along, in one small way. When Vivian mentioned that next week that she wanted to host a proper family Sunday, everyone together, I didn't make an excuse the way I usually did. I said yes. I said we'd love to. I said everyone should be there. And I watched her eyes light up because she thought I'd just agreed to attend my own execution. Those 13 days were the longest of my life. I want you to understand what they cost, because the version where I calmly outmaneuvered her isn't the true one. The true one is that I lay awake next to my sleeping husband every single night, sick with it. I second-guessed myself constantly. What if I was wrong about the locket? What if there was nothing in her past and I'd let her humiliate my daughter for nothing? What if letting it reach the table blew up my marriage in a way I couldn't put back together? There were nights I nearly woke Mark up and told him everything. There were mornings I nearly drove to that lab myself and begged them to lose the paperwork. But then I'd go to work and I'd sit with someone in their last days, and I'd feel it again. The weight coming off them at the end, the locked room finally opening. And I'd remember that Vivian was carrying a room like that. I'd felt it for 7 years. And I'd think about Lily, 3 years old, about to be turned into a question mark at her own grandmother's table. And I'd think, no, not my daughter. If this ugly thing is going to happen, it is going to happen in the full light, where it can never be twisted, where it ends instead of festering. And I'd hold the line one more day. One evening near the end, Lily climbed into my lap while I was staring at nothing, and she put her small hands on my face and said, "Mommy, you have your worried eyes." 3 years old, she could already read me. And I made her a promise, out loud, even though she couldn't understand it. I said, "I'm going to make sure nobody ever gets to say you don't belong. Not ever. That's my job." And she said, "Okay," and asked for juice, and went back to her blocks. And that was the promise I carried into that dining room. The Sunday came. It was the middle of April. I dressed Lily in a green dress with a little collar. I brushed her red curls, and I felt the particular calm I feel walking into a room where someone is dying. The calm of knowing exactly what's coming and having made your peace with your part in it. The whole family came. Warren, quiet in his chair by the window, nursing one beer all afternoon the way he did. Courtney and her husband Dennis, Courtney lit up with a nervous, hungry energy I didn't understand until later, the energy of someone who's been told there's going to be a show. Mark's cousin Rob and his wife. And Margot. I have to tell you about Margot, because I didn't know yet how much she mattered. Margot was Vivian's older sister, 72, soft-spoken, a little stooped. I'd met her exactly twice in 7 years, at a funeral and a Christmas, and both times I'd noticed the way she watched her younger sister. Carefully, quietly, the way you watch a stretch of weather you've lived through before and know the shape of. She sat at the far end that day, near Lily, and she let my daughter show her the noodles on her fork, and she smiled at her with a sadness I couldn't place. Now I can place it. She was looking at a red-haired child about to be put on trial for her own bloodline, and she was the only person in that room who knew the family had done this exact thing before. 11 of us, around the long table under the good chandelier Vivian only used for occasions. And Vivian was luminous. I had never, in 7 years, seen her so happy, so lifted. She'd cooked all morning, the whole house smelled of it. She kept touching the locket, and this time she didn't hide it, because she was too full of what was coming. She'd made a real spread, her mother's recipes, the performance of a woman who believed she was 2 hours from finally, permanently, being proven right about the girl her son had brought home from nowhere. She seated me directly across from her, not beside her. She wanted the sightline. She wanted to watch my face when it happened, and dinner was almost pleasant, in the way the last calm hour before a storm is pleasant, when the light goes gold and strange and the birds go quiet. Mark, who knew nothing, because I had told him nothing, and I will answer for that, I promise you I've answered for that, laughed easily at his father's story about the garage. Lily sat in her booster beside me, eating buttered noodles with her fingers, holding court with Margot, wearing her green dress. And across the table, Vivian watched me with a small, private smile, passing the rolls, refilling the water, waiting for dessert. Waiting for her moment. Certain, so certain, that she was about to win. I was certain of something too. I just let her keep her version a little longer. Then she tapped her glass with her ring. "Before dessert," she said, "there's something I need to share with the family. It concerns all of us. And I've prayed about whether to do this, but I believe the truth matters more than comfort." She reached down beside her chair and brought up the manila envelope, and she slid it across the table toward Mark. "I had a test done," she said. Her voice was steady, righteous, almost gentle. "On Lily. I know how this sounds, but a mother, a grandmother, has to protect her family. And I think, Mark, when you see what's in there, you'll understand why I couldn't stay silent about who your wife really is." The table went silent. Warren set down his fork. Courtney's eyes went wide with the thrill of it. Mark's face drained white, and he looked at me. One terrible, searching look. And I understood what that look was asking. And I understood that I had let him sit in the dark for 13 days, and that I would have to live with that. I met his eyes. And I said the only thing I said in that entire first act. I said, "Open it, Mark. It's all right. Read it out loud." I wanted it in the air. I wanted witnesses. I had waited 13 days for exactly this, and I was not going to let Vivian control how it was read. Mark's hands were shaking. He opened the envelope, he pulled out the pages, and Vivian, this is the part I'll remember when I'm dying, sat back with the serene face of a woman about to be proven right about everything. She didn't even lean forward to read along. She was that certain. Mark read the first page, and his face changed, but not the way his mother had spent 13 days imagining it would. She'd pictured devastation, betrayal, her son's world ending, and herself the tragic hero who'd had the courage to show him the truth. Instead, the white drained out of his face and was replaced by something that made her smile falter. Relief, flooding in, and then a rising, bewildered anger. "It's a paternity test," he said slowly, reading. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Lily is my biological daughter. He looked up at his mother and his voice cracked down the middle. Mom, she's mine. She was always mine. You tested my little girl behind my back to prove… What? What did you think you were going to find? Vivian's serene certainty flickered for the first time. This was not the scene she'd rehearsed in her head for 13 days. Well, no, there must be more. Keep reading. The lab sometimes… She was reaching now, the righteousness cracking. There's more to it than one page, Mark. Read the rest. They'd have found… There's a second page, Mark said. And something in how he said it made the whole table go still, because he'd already glanced at it, and his face was doing something new. And here is where the room changed forever. And here is where I learned that instinct, the kind you build sitting with the dying, is a truer thing than any certainty. Because Vivian, wanting every possible weapon, had ordered the deepest test the lab offered. Not just Lily against Mark, but Lily against the whole ancestry database. She'd wanted to point at a stranger and say, "There, that's the real father." Instead, the test did what she never imagined. The second page was a list of relatives. Mark read down it slowly. At the top, exactly where they belonged, himself, the father, Warren. The Merrick line, marching down the paternal side, and then the maternal side, my side, where there should have been only my small known family, my mother, an aunt, 2 cousins. Instead, flagged in bold, a close match, the kind of number the database uses for the closest blood. To a man named James Bellamy. A man in his 40s. A man none of us had ever heard of. "Who's James Bellamy?" Mark said. And then the page did the thing that turns a name into a bomb. It showed how James connected to the rest of us. His match climbed up 1 generation and landed, in bold, on a name we all knew. It landed on Vivian. Mark stopped reading. The whole table was leaning in now, and Margot, Vivian's older sister, Margot closed her eyes, just for a second. Just long enough for me to notice. The way a person closes their eyes when a thing they've kept for 40 years finally arrives at the door. "Mom," Mark said, and his voice had gone strange. "Why is there a man on here who matches you? A son, 44 years old." He looked up. "Mom, who is James Bellamy?" I have spent 15 years watching people's faces at the moment the thing they buried comes back up. I know that face. It is not shock. Shock is for surprises. This was something older and heavier. It was the face of a woman watching a door she nailed shut 4 decades ago swing slowly open in front of everyone she'd ever tried to be respectable for. Vivian did not answer. Her hand went to the locket, and it was Margot who answered, because someone finally had to, after 44 years. Margot, the soft-spoken older sister who'd watched Vivian like weather her whole life, set down her napkin. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady, and it filled that silent room the way only a very old truth can. "His name is James," she said. Vivian had him in the spring of 1979. She was 19 years old. There was a boy, a good boy actually, a mechanic, but not the right kind of family, our mother said. Margot's mouth twisted on the phrase. So our parents sent her away. Told the whole town she'd gone to Ohio to help our aunt through a hard pregnancy. The irony of that was lost on them. She had the baby in a home for girls like her, the kind they had then. They made her give him up. She came back to us in the fall with empty arms and a story about Ohio. And she was never the same girl again. Margot looked at her sister, and she has not said his name out loud 1 time in 44 years. Not to me, not to anyone. She wore him around her neck instead. Vivian's fingers were bone white around the locket now. She still hadn't spoken. She couldn't. "I always wondered, Viv," Margot went on, and there wasn't a drop of cruelty in it, only a vast and terrible tiredness. the tiredness of a woman who has watched her little sister carry a stone up a hill for 44 years. I wondered why you got so hard, why you cared so much, more than anybody, about who belonged and who didn't, who was the right sort and who wasn't good enough, who really counted as family. She turned and looked very gently at Lily, 3 years old, green dress, red curls, a ring of butter around her mouth, watching the grown-ups with wide eyes. You gave up a child because our parents decided a mechanic's boy didn't belong in this family. And you have spent every year since deciding the same thing about everyone who came through that door. Diane. And now, God help you, you were about to do it to that baby right there. Your own son's daughter. You were going to make her the same kind of question they made your boy. I want to tell you what I did in that moment because it is the opposite of what Vivian would have done. And it is the whole reason I can live with the 13 days. I could have let her burn. God knows the symmetry was perfect. The woman who tested my daughter's blood to prove she didn't belong had, with her own hand, with her own money, exhumed the child she'd decided didn't belong 44 years ago. She had built the machine and fed herself into it. I could have sat back, the way she had, and enjoyed being right. I didn't. Because I had spent 15 years learning that there is no dignity in watching a person drown, even a person who tried to drown you. And because Lily was in the room. So I stood up. 11 faces turned to me, braced. I think half of them expected me to finally, gloriously let Vivian have it. 7 years of it, all at once, right in her ruined face. God knows she'd earned it. God knows I'd rehearsed it in my head on enough sleepless nights. I didn't. I walked around that long table, past Courtney's smeared mascara, past Warren's bowed head, and I did the thing no one had done for Vivian Merrick in 44 years. I went and stood beside her, on her side, while the worst thing she'd ever done sat exposed in the middle of her own table. I put my hand on her shoulder. She flinched like she'd been struck, because kindness, to a certain kind of person, is the one blow they never learn to take. "Vivian," I said, quietly, just for her, though the room was silent enough to hear it. "Listen to me. Your son is alive. He's 44 years old and he's in that database, which means he's been looking for his family, or he never would have spit in that tube. You don't get the 44 years back. Nobody's giving those back to you. But you are not too late for the rest of them. Do you hear me? You are not too late for what's left." I crouched down so I was level with her. "I know a little something about being decided against by this family," I said. "You made sure I'd learn it. And I would not wish that feeling on anyone in this world. Not even the man you were about to hand it to. So don't. Don't do to your own boy what was done to you. You have one chance right now to be different than the people who drove you to Ohio. Take it." She looked up at me. And for the first time in the 7 years I had known her, for the first time, I think, in decades, Vivian Merrick had nothing in her face at all. No smile, no appraisal, no weather moving in. All of it was gone, stripped clean away. And what was left underneath was just a 19-year-old girl who'd been driven to a home in Ohio by her own father and made to come back with empty arms, looking out through a 68-year-old woman's eyes. I'd finally met her. After 7 years, at the worst possible moment, I finally met the person under the armor. She'd been in there the whole time. I'd like to tell you she thanked me. She didn't. This channel doesn't sell the endings we wish for. What she did was worse and truer. She stood up unsteadily. She missed her chair and caught the edge of the table. And she said to no one, to the room, to 44 years, "I did what I was told. I did what they told me to do." And then she walked out of her own dining room, and we heard her bedroom door close. And the 11 of us sat in the wreckage of her Sunday with the buttered noodles going cold. Courtney was crying. Warren had his face in his hands. And I understood, watching him, that he had known. Some part of him had always known there was a locket he was never allowed to ask about. Mark was holding the pages like they might catch fire. And Lily, 3 years old, tugged my sleeve and said, "Mommy, why is Grandma sad?" And I picked up my daughter with the beautiful red curls that started all of it. And I said, "Grandma found someone she lost a long time ago, baby. Sometimes that makes people cry before it makes them happy." The aftermath. 3 things: the practical, the painful, and the one that healed. The practical. The test Vivian ordered to prove I didn't belong instead proved, in front of 11 witnesses, that I was exactly who I'd always said I was. A woman who married a man and had his child and never told a single lie about any of it. The only fraud at that table, it turned out, was the woman who'd spent 7 years accusing me of being one. And something ended that day that had ruled that family for 3 decades. Vivian's authority. I don't mean anyone shouted at her or cast her out. Nobody did. It was quieter and more total than that. For 30 years, Vivian's power ran on a single engine, her position as the one who got to decide. Who was the right kind of person? Who really counted as a Merrick? Who belonged and who was merely tolerated? That engine ran on her being above the question herself. Unimpeachable, the judge. And you cannot be the judge of who belongs after an entire family has watched you exile your own infant son and then, 44 years later, accidentally dig him back up with a test you ordered to exile somebody else. The moral high ground she'd stood on for 30 years just dissolved. At the next holiday, when she started in on someone, in the old way, with the old appraising smile, it didn't land anymore. Somebody changed the subject, and Vivian heard it, the not landing, and she stopped. Some kinds of power only work in the dark. Somebody had turned the light on in that dining room, and it never really went back off. She turned it on herself, and it came with hard lines, because mercy without lines is just permission. Mark told his mother, plainly, that she would never again be alone with Lily. Not out of spite, but because a woman who tests a child's blood in secret has shown you exactly how far she'll go, and you believe her. Vivian is in our daughter's life now, only in rooms where I am also in the room. She knows why. She has never argued it, which is the closest she comes to admitting what she did. The grandmother who tried to prove Lily didn't belong now sees Lily only on Lily's mother's terms. That is the price, and it is permanent, and I will not be talked out of it, not even by the softer things I'm about to tell you. I took no joy in the collapse of her, which surprised me. I'd spent 7 years imagining what it would feel like to see Vivian brought down, and when it finally came, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like watching a building you'd hated your whole life finally fall, and realizing there'd been someone trapped inside it the entire time. But make no mistake, I did not rebuild the building. I just stopped hating it. The lines stayed up. The painful thing. Mark and his mother don't really speak anymore. And that is a grief I carry more quietly than he knows. Think about what happened to my husband at that table. In the span of 10 minutes, he learned that his mother had secretly tested his daughter's blood to break his marriage, and that his mother had a whole sealed room inside her he'd never once suspected. A brother, a 44-year-old brother, given away before Mark was ever born, hidden his entire life. He grew up an only son. He was never an only son. Every childhood memory rearranged itself in front of him at that table. That's a lot to survive between the roast and the dessert. And some of his grief, in the months after, leaked toward me. Because I had known. For 13 days I had known what was coming, and I had kissed him goodnight for 13 nights and said nothing. And I had let him walk into his mother's dining room with no armor on. He asked me, once, quietly, in the dark, "Why didn't you just tell me?" And I told him the truth. That if I'd told him, he'd have confronted her and she'd have buried it, and we'd have spent the next 20 years with a woman who'd tested our daughter and gotten away clean, still smiling, still appraising, still deciding. That it had to come up in the light, in front of everyone, or it would have gone back into the dark forever. That I did it for Lily, so that no one at that table could ever again make our daughter a question. He understood it. He's told me he forgives me, and I believe him. But I forgive you and I've forgotten it are two different sentences, and I don't push on the space between them. I made a choice to let a loaded thing go off, knowing my husband was standing near the blast. I'd make the same choice again. And I still watch the cost of it cross his face some evenings when he's quiet, and I let him be quiet, because that's the price, and I agreed to pay it. And here is the thing that healed. It's the one I never saw coming. The one that makes me believe, on my better days, that things bend toward mercy if you let them. James Bellamy is real. A week after that dinner, a message came through the database, careful, formal, terrified in the way of a man who's been rehearsing an introduction his whole life. I don't want to cause any trouble for anyone, he wrote. I was adopted in 1979. I've always known. I'm not looking for money or for anything to change. I just wanted to know where I came from. If that's not welcome, I understand, and I'll go. 44 years old, and still asking permission to exist. I read that message and I wept, because I knew that particular ask. I'd been making a quieter version of it at that family's door for 7 years. Mark wrote back. It took him 3 days to find the words, and I watched him write and delete and write again at the kitchen table. And then they met. And my husband has a brother now. James is a carpenter. He builds staircases, the good kind, the kind that last 100 years. He has Vivian's exact hands. I noticed it the first time, those long, careful fingers. And absolutely none of her hardness, because he was raised by people who apparently just loved him without conditions, which is its own kind of luck. The first time he stood in our kitchen, he and Mark circled each other like two dogs deciding whether to fight or play. Then James saw the coffee maker was the same model he had, and said so. They both laughed too hard at nothing. And that was that. Brothers. Watching them, I understood the full size of what had happened. The test Vivian ordered as a weapon to blow apart her son's family had, instead, handed her son the brother she'd spent 44 years making sure he'd never have. She'd tried to prove my daughter didn't belong, and instead she'd brought home the child she'd been told didn't belong. The machine she built to exile turned around and brought someone home. And Lily adores him. She calls him Uncle James. He made her a little 3-legged stool with her name carved in it, and she stands on it to brush her teeth. She has no idea, none, that she's the reason he's in our lives. Her red curls, the ones her great-grandmother's family sent a 19-year-old girl to Ohio over, were the thread that pulled the whole buried truth back into the light. Someday I'll tell her. Someday I'll tell her she found her uncle before she could even spell her own name. And Vivian. This is the last thing, and the hardest to explain, and the truest. Vivian met James once, 6 months later, and it was her idea, which shocked everyone. I drove her. She asked me, not Mark, which told me something about what she'd finally understood about who in that family knew about being decided against. She was silent most of the 2 hours. Once, to the window, she said, "They didn't give me a choice in 1979. My father drove me there himself. I held him one day. And nothing else, and I didn't push, because I know when silence is the kindest thing you can offer." At the door, this enormous, careful man and this small, hard woman looked at each other for the first time in 44 years, and neither could speak. And Vivian reached up and took off the locket, the one none of us had ever been allowed to ask about, and opened it, and I saw what she'd carried against her chest for 44 years. A photograph of a 1-day-old baby, and a date scratched in the gold. She'd been wearing her exiled son the whole time she was exiling everyone else. She put it in his hand, and she couldn't say she was sorry. That word was never in her. But she said 4 words. I never took it off. And for Vivian, that was the entire confession. James's chin shook and he said, "Thank you." And that was all either of them could carry. It's not forgiveness. It's not a happy ending. It's just a door, finally open, that she'd spent her whole life leaning against to keep shut. But I don't want to end this on Vivian, because the story was never really hers, however much of it she took up. I want to end it where it belongs. With Lily. She's 5 now. She still has the red curls, wilder every year, the curls that a family once sent a 19-year-old girl to Ohio over, the curls Vivian did math about across a dinner table. And here is what those curls mean in our house now. Nothing at all. They're just my daughter's beautiful hair. Nobody in her life is allowed to turn them into a question, and nobody ever will again, because I stood at a table and made sure of it. That was the whole job. That was the only test. The other night she climbed into my lap. She still does that. I'm grateful every time. And she said, apropos of nothing, "Mommy, I'm a Merrick, right?" Somebody at school had been talking about last names, and I said, "You're a Merrick, and you're my girl, and you belong to us all the way down to your toes, and nobody gets to say any different." And she said, "I know," in that bored way 5-year-olds say the thing you'd have given anything to hear at their age. She already knew. She's never once doubted it. That's the difference between her childhood and the one Vivian had, and the one I had. And it's the only inheritance I ever cared about leaving her. So that's the story. A grandmother who tested a child's blood to prove she didn't belong. A daughter of a house cleaner who learned, from sitting with the dying, that the cruelest people are almost always guarding the deepest wound. And a locket, worn for 44 years, that finally got handed to the person it was always a photograph of. If you've ever had someone decide you didn't belong, appraise you at the door, do math over your child, run their quiet campaign to prove you were never the right kind of person, hear this from a woman who lived it for 7 years. The people who are hardest about who belongs are almost always the people who were once decided against themselves and never healed it. That is not your job to fix, and it is not your fault. But it can be your freedom, because it means their cruelty was never really about you. You were just the mirror they couldn't stand to look in. So here's what I'll leave you with, from a woman who spent 7 years being appraised at a door. The real test was never the one in that envelope. The real test came after, in the wreckage, when I got to choose who I'd be. Vivian handed me the same knife she'd carried for 44 years. It was right there, still warm, and God knows she'd earned having it turned on her. I put it down instead. Not because she deserved that, because my little girl was watching me, and I would rather she grow up knowing her mother chose mercy over the satisfaction of being right. Stay kind. Stay steady. Don't give them the fight they're fishing for. And let the truth come up on its own. It always does. In 15 years beside the dying, I've never once seen a buried thing stay buried. But that's not where I want to leave you. I want to leave you where I left off with Lily, in my lap the other night, when she asked me if she was a Merrick. Because that's the whole story, in the end. Not whose blood is whose, not what was in the envelope. Just a little girl with red curls who has never once, not for a single day of her life, had to wonder whether she belonged. She belongs, all the way down to her toes. Nobody at any table will ever tell her different, because her mother made sure of it. That's the only test I have ever cared about passing. Take care of your own house. Take care of the people in it. There's a new confession here every day, and I'll see you in the next one.